So good afternoon. My name is Dorothy Burridge, and I'm the Regional Education Coordinator with the Central East Stroke Network. And on behalf of the Central East Stroke Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, What's New in Aerobics? Updates to the aerobic exercise recommendations to optimize best practices in care after stroke, presented by Dr. Ada Tang. Before I turn it over to our presenter, I just would like to remind you that you're welcome to submit questions by typing them into the questions section of our control panel, and we will have some time at the end to address some of those questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tang. She is a physical therapist, associate professor in the School of Rehabilitation Science at McMaster University, and a clinician scientist with the Ontario Heart and Stroke Foundation. Dr. Tang has extensive clinical experience in adult stroke and acquired brain injury rehabilitation at the Toronto Rehab Institute. She carries this clinical experience into her research program with the MAC Stroke Canada research team, whose work is focused on exercise and cardiovascular health in people living with stroke, particularly as these relate to cardiovascular risk factors and prevention of cardiovascular disease. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tang.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'd like to thank particularly the Central East Stroke Network for having me share the updates for the aerobics guidelines today. I'm happy to take questions at the end, but certainly if there are any burning questions in the middle, I can be flagged and then try to address them as we go along. So the aerobics guidelines were developed in 2013 and they were just updated in 2019. So this is a nice opportunity to be able to connect with the network and just share some of the updates to the guidelines. I just have some objectives for today's session. We'll start off very briefly to discuss the evidence of the benefits of exercise for people with stroke, and we'll talk about how the aerobics recommendations can be used to guide practice in implementing exercise for the stroke population, and then also how they can be applied across the continuum and across different settings of stroke recovery. So this slide seems a little funny because if we didn't care about stroke, I suppose there wouldn't be anyone on this webinar. But some of the interesting projections around the impact of stroke for Canada have been updated fairly recently and showing that certainly there's more Canadians living with the effects of stroke than had been previously believed. And within the next 25 years, there's going to be upwards of 700,000 Canadians living with stroke. People with stroke, of course, are at high risk of recurrent stroke. Almost 40% within 10 years after the event, but still 26% within 5 years. And because of that high risk and the associated high prevalence of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular comorbidities, you know, if we can find ways to help manage that, it is really important. But we know that fitness and physical activity is low in stroke. When we think about fitness and what's the impact of cardiovascular disease, this graph here shows a nice inverse correlation between these two factors. So when we have across the bottom of the graph the percentile or kind of category of aerobic capacity, and then on the side, on the y-axis, the relative risk for CVD, it's clear that the lower your fitness levels are, the higher the risk is. But what's interesting in this graph is that it's not a linear relationship. In fact, the people that are in the lowest fitness categories, if we can move them up one category, they actually have a much greater reduction in the relative risk than if we move further along the scale. And so when we think about our population being one where aerobic capacity or aerobic fitness is quite compromised, every little bit is going to help, and certainly the most compromised cohort of our population will get more bang for our buck to help them improve their aerobic fitness. The evidence also suggests that fitness is important for function. And in this graph that was published in a paper by Michelle Plowman at Memorial University and Liam Kelly, shows the metabolic requirements for doing a lot of everyday activities. So across the bar here, we have kind of low metabolic demand activities such as basic ADLs, eating, bathing, and then as you kind of go across, when we get into walking, more instrumental activities of daily living, climbing stairs and sport and running, that kind of thing, obviously the demands are going to be higher. The hashtag that's kind of in the middle of the bar indicates what's the minimum threshold of capacity, fitness levels that are required to do everyday activities. So just to do your everyday ADLs needs to be kind of between 3 and 4 METs. When we look at where the studies have measured peak MET levels for people with stroke, they're all below this threshold. They are not sufficient enough to manage a lot of our everyday activities, let alone doing some of the more kind of instrumental and community-based and certainly leisure activities beyond basic ADLs. So this highlights to us that fitness is not only important for reduction in cardiovascular risk, but also important for everyday function. So the evidence is clear that exercise can be helpful for the stroke population. A Cochrane review at the top, it shows now there's almost 60 trials of nearly 3,000 participants. When the combined effects of all of these studies are examined, that fitness can improve function. That includes walking speed and walking endurance, but also improves fitness at aerobic capacity. So if we're starting to move the dial, we can show that we can move the dial on that. More recently, our meta-analysis, as well as a couple of others that have come out, have shown that aerobic exercise and physical activity can actually help some of the cardiovascular risk factors, and that hadn't been shown prior to this. We can actually improve, because these studies needed to be much larger in sample size, we now have enough studies to show that we can reduce systolic blood pressure in people with stroke. And knowing that blood pressure is one of the main independent risk factors for stroke, this is a really important finding, but also other factors such as insulin, glucose, and HDL cholesterol levels as well. So knowing all of this evidence, does it translate into real life? An early study that was done found that really, when we look at stroke rehab sessions, PT and OT sessions, and how much time people spend in aerobic heart rate zones, back in 2002, it was very little. You can see that it was less than 5 minutes of time was spent in what we would consider to be aerobic heart rate zones. Since then, though, as the evidence has continued to emerge and therapists are more abreast with kind of what the evidence is saying, are recognizing that aerobic exercise should be incorporated into stroke rehab, but also acknowledge there's a lot of day-to-day practice barriers that kind of present as challenge for full implementation. These might be concerns related to patients themselves, perhaps around their safety or their ability to, if fatigue is an issue, and operational concerns that may reflect kind of the institutions in which therapists work, where you're operating under limited resources and really short lengths of stay and staffing shortages that make this implementation really challenging. We also know from the individuals with stroke, their point of view, that their physical activity levels remain low. So they often perform less activity than they're capable. And this is a graph that shows this, a study that was done tracking people's free living physical activity. So they wore accelerometers on their hip for a number of days, and then also plotted against what their 6-minute walk test distance was. So that's along the bottom axis. And in general, you can see this nice positive relationship, meaning that the further that someone is able to walk on the 6-minute walk test, generally that translates to more activity in free living, in kind of everyday living. But there also are a lot of data points along the bottom, which indicates that even for people who are able to walk quite far distances on the 6-minute walk test, 400, 500, 600 meters, a lot of them still remain quite inactive. So this is where we are. We are standing at the edge of this precipice and knowing what the current state of knowledge is, and also recognizing that this is the clinical reality of practice as well as everyday behaviors for people with stroke. How can we bridge this gap? How can we connect what we know based on the evidence to what we can do in our practice every day? So this is kind of one of the things that spurred the development of the original aerobics guidelines. A consensus panel was struck, and it was led by Dr. Marilyn McKay-Lyons at Dalhousie University and her co-chair, Richard Macco, who's a neurologist in Baltimore, in Maryland. And they assembled a group of researchers, of clinicians, of someone from the Heart and Stroke Foundation, interdisciplinary from multiple areas of practice to start to develop these guidelines. And I was very lucky to be part of this. We were able to go to a really beautiful spot in just outside Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and this is an aerial view of where we were. If you're going to develop consensus panel guidelines anywhere, I would say this is an idyllic location. It was right on the ocean, and then there was a point just kind of beyond the buildings over there where we could go hiking, and it was a nice way to kind of break up the day. But it was a really great opportunity to bring this international panel of speakers together, experts together, and develop guidelines based on the evidence and based on consensus. So the purpose of this consensus meeting was to consolidate what was known at the time about aerobic exercise for people with stroke, and to bring them together into a concise and user-friendly set of recommendations for clinicians. And ultimately, that set of recommendations would hopefully help to promote implementation of aerobic exercise after a cerebrovascular event through KT and professional development. And so this was the group. Marilyn also had two beautiful dogs that helped to spur the the discussion and the consensus. It was always easy to come to consensus when there were dogs in the room. So this is the process of it. The consensus panel was formed. There was a literature synthesis that was prepared, and then of course we had the workshop. That was 2 full days. Outside Lunenburg, as I said. Once the consensus panel meeting was completed, there was a smaller working group that set out to refine the recommendations that came out of that meeting, and circulate it back to the larger consensus panel to review those revised recommendations. And then those recommendations were sent out to external reviewers and focus group for feedback. So this was something that we felt was really important to ensure kind of the rigor of the development of these guidelines, that they were evaluated by external reviewers. And these were an international panel of experts from Canada and US and Ireland and Scotland, from physiotherapy to physiatry and geriatric medicine and exercise physiology. So it was quite a diverse group of people who had reviewed it. And there was also a focus group that consisted of people living with stroke as well as caregiver for their kind of lived experience feedback as well. Once the guidelines had gone through the external reviewer and stakeholder feedback, the recommendations were revised, and then it went back out to the consensus panel to rate the strength of each recommendation. And the recommendations were refined if there was less than 80% agreement. Again, this is all just to kind of establish the rigor of how the guidelines were developed. And the consensus panel would rate the strength of the revised recommendations, and then finally the recommendations were disseminated. So at the end of the day, we came up with the original document, which is the 2013 aerobics guidelines, that had 18 recommendations in total. 7 were related to screening for safe exercise prescription, and 11 were related to exercise prescription. So these were the 7 guidelines that were related to screening. We worded them to try to be as user-friendly as possible. So you can see here, it was questions such as, who should be considered for aerobic exercise, when should they be screened, who should determine if they are safe, and what information is needed, is a stress test indicated, that kind of thing. And then in part 2, where it pertains to prescription of aerobic exercise, the questions were all around, how do we actually implement this? How does it fit with overall management of stroke? Where should it be done? Who should be doing it? In what format? In what mode? How hard? How long? How intense? So these were the original set of guidelines. And each guideline, individual guideline, was basically formatted in this way, where there was kind of the guideline at the top, the recommendation at the top, a statement about the level of evidence and the strength of the recommendation and the agreement amongst the panelists. So you kind of had a sense of how strong the recommendation was made. So a blurb about the rationale, about implementations for the healthcare system, suggested performance measures, so potentially, outcome measures to evaluate how effective this recommendation was implemented, as well as just a summary of the evidence. So since 2013, a lot of evidence has continued to emerge, and that led to an update that, as I mentioned earlier, was published in 2019. So this is the 2019 update to the aerobics guidelines, and I've provided the link here for you to access the full set of guidelines. They're freely available there. And in the 2019 guidelines, it was an update in terms of new references that went into the guidelines that either replaced or supplemented the original document. There were some recommendations that were reworded for clarity and, again, to reflect the new evidence, and I'll go over some of these following. And then there were 2 new recommendations that were added. So the first part of the guidelines around pre-participation screening, those are still, for the most part, the same. The 2 new recommendations that were added were here, 2.10 and 2.11, what should be monitored and how to progress, those were new. And then 2.13, the very last one, encouraging long-term engagement, which was just a reword. In the original set of guidelines, it was around overcoming barriers. And then in the 2019 guidelines, it's just kind of taking a more broad approach, not just overcoming the barriers, but also encouraging long-term engagement. Okay, so I'll go now into kind of the highlights of the new guidelines. So for example, in the first one, 1.1, who should be considered for aerobic exercise? This is where some of the new evidence came to update the level of evidence to support why exercise is important. So for example, outcomes related to improved balance and improved mobility previously was a level of evidence B, and now is level evidence A, meaning there are several RCT, randomized controlled trials, to support this. The benefits of exercise to emotional well-being was also upgraded from a level of evidence C to now B. Quality of life was also upgraded, and a new section on impact on bone health, although it's a level evidence C, was not present or available in the first set of guidelines, but now there's some evidence to suggest that aerobic exercise can improve bone health. The authors also noted that in terms of exercise and how it benefits cognition, there was no change in the level of evidence, but certainly the number of references that have come out starting to look at and identify the benefits of exercise to cognition have been identified and outlined in the new recommendations. For number 1.5, when is a stress test indicated? This one was an interesting one and something that I've had a lot of discussions with clinicians about. In terms of the level of evidence, there is no change. There hasn't been any new evidence that have come out, and really this is meaning that this guideline or this recommendation was based on expert opinion. There's still a lot of disparity that remains between what is done and what can be done in research versus what is actually done in clinical practice, and we certainly do recognize that. We know that stress tests can provide useful information, but whether there's a threshold for when or how hard, what the intensity of exercise has to be for a stress test to be indicated has not been systematically validated. So where the original guidelines had suggested that stress test is the gold standard and should be encouraged as much as possible, the new guidelines are saying, you know, if we mandate that stress tests are required, it may create a barrier to exercise prescription. So the wording of this one recommendation has been altered a little bit. So I just took an excerpt from the original guidelines. It used to say this, that exercise stress test should be an integral component of pre-participation screening, but if the targeted intensity of the planned training program is light and the participant is without symptoms or without a history of CVD and has normal ECG, then you may consider it a clinically based submaximal test. The wording has been changed somewhat just to give us a little bit more latitude for when we might require a stress test. And it now says that whenever feasible, a symptom-limited or a submaximal exercise stress test should be a component of pre-participation screening. So it gives us the latitude to use submax tests, exercise tests, when that might be more feasible in your setting, and particularly if the intensity, the planned intensity of aerobic exercise is at the lower end of intensity, so less than 50% of heart rate reserve, then certainly a submax test might be an option. The next recommendation, which is 1.6, how should the exercise test be conducted? Again, this is just the wording has been reworded a little bit, where it had mandated that a peak exercise symptom limited protocol should be used wherever possible. Now says that a symptom limited or submaximal exercise test with ECG monitoring should be administered with adequate warm up and cool down. And then the rest of the wording is the same. The patient should be on usual meds, avoid strenuous activity for 24 hours prior to testing, avoid a heavy meal, caffeine, nicotine within 3 hours of testing. So again, just a shift in the wording for how the exercise test should be conducted. Submax exercise tests can involve walking tests or stepping or cycling at workloads that are consistent with the planned intensity of the training program. So that was just kind of to acknowledge that, you know, while a peak exercise test might be the gold standard, we aren't often exercising people at those peak intensities. We're going to be training them at submaximal intensities. So if we can test them up to those planned intensities, we can screen them for anything that might happen untoward within those intensities, but not beyond. Alternatively, submaximal field tests, so such as a 6-minute walk test or a shuttle walk test, can also be used, and they usually entail some, predefined time or distance, which are clinically more feasible, maybe a little bit harder to establish an exercise prescription on, though. Recommendation 1.7, what should be monitored. There is no change in this recommendation. It's still a level of evidence of A, but the wording was just revised a little bit, that clinical signs and symptoms such as RPE, heart rate, blood pressure, and RPE should be monitored before, during, and after the test, and then also until baseline values are approximated following recovery, and an ECG if using a stress test. Skipping ahead to recommendation 2.9, so this is related to exercise prescription. At what intensity should the exercise be performed? Again, there's no change in terms of the level of evidence, but the wording was revised slightly. Both the original and the new guidelines recommend that percentage of heart rate reserve is often used to prescribe intensity, but you could use something like percent of heart rate max or an RPE, are also commonly and appropriately used when heart rate might be compromised by medications such as beta blockers that could blunt heart rate response to exercise. The targets of intensity are outlined in the new guidelines. Light intensity is now defined as less than 40% of heart rate reserve. It previously was 45. So just giving, again, a little bit more latitude in terms of what we would consider to be light intensity. And moderate and vigorous intensity would be either between 40 to 60% of heart rate reserve or more than 60% of heart rate reserve. And the corresponding RPE values are there on the 0 to 10 scale. In the full guidelines themselves, they actually give target values for the 6 to 20 RPE scale. So if you wanted to go to the full guidelines to see that, they're available there. And the guidelines also provide just a couple of different resources. This is a pictorial version of what the RPE scale might look like. If, for instance, you might be doing walking exercise versus cycling exercise, or just some pictures showing a facial expressions to correspond with the ratings of perceived exertion. And the other resource that is available in the guidelines is this table that kind of shows across the different ways that you can monitor intensity and what would be the corresponding descriptors. So whether it's very light, moderate, vigorous activity, and what would the corresponding kind of percent of heart rate reserve be, percent of heart rate max be, RPE, whether it's on the 6 to 20 or 0 to 10 scale or on the talk test. So that's just excerpted from the guidelines. Recommendation 2.10 is a new recommendation, and that we recognize that wasn't included in the original recommendation. So what should be monitored? And certainly if we're going to embark on an exercise program, we should also be monitoring their exercise. And there's strong evidence to support monitoring. What should be monitored, although they do acknowledge, the authors acknowledge there was little information about maybe how often. But certainly as clinicians, we would, be observing general responses to exercise throughout the session, and then also frequent monitoring of heart rate, whether that's through a heart rate monitor or through kind of pulse rates, and periodic blood pressure and RPE monitoring. Typically what we might do is monitor blood pressure a little bit more frequently when someone's embarking on a new program, maybe every 5 minutes if that's possible. But if once you know that blood pressure is fairly stable and responding appropriately, you might not need to continue to monitor with that frequency as they continue training with you. Recommendation 2.11 is also a new recommendation, and this is how to progress. So this, again, wasn't identified as a recommendation in the original set of guidelines, but certainly an important part of our exercise training programs for our clients, that we want to be able to progress them as they continue to get fitter. So this is a new recommendation. The level evidence is at B right now. There is RCT evidence to support progression, but none have actually directly compared protocols. So if you're progressing at 10% per week for this many weeks versus 5% per week, that part hasn't been done yet. In any case, progression should always be kind of gradual and individualized for each person, suggesting that maybe in terms of exercise time, you might progress 5 to 10 minutes every 1 or 2 weeks for the first 4 to 6 weeks. If fitness is quite compromised at the beginning and they're not able to do kind of 20 to 30 minutes of continuous exercise, and then once you have continuous 20 to 30 minutes of exercise, that's when you might start to progress intensity next, maybe nudging heart rate reserve at 5 to 10% every 1 to 4 weeks, depending on how they're tolerating. And then recommendation 2.13, this is just the last one. This is one that I'd mentioned earlier. It's just reframed a recommendation. In the previous set of guidelines, it was around encouraging long-term or reducing barriers to exercise, but now it's kind of taking a more broad approach and encouraging long-term engagement. So highlighting that, you know, the transition from a more structured program that they might be doing with you within rehab or within a community program to more independent and less structured or self-directed physical activity and exercise at home or in their communities, and identifying a number of strategies that could be used that aim to address these barriers that are maybe related to either us as healthcare providers, to the participant themselves and their comfort level and their self-efficacy for exercise, as well as maybe helping them work through some environmental barriers that they may foresee preventing them from keeping up with the exercise program that you've started with them. So that's just a very quick high-level overview of some of the key changes from the aerobics in the most recent set of guidelines. So here we are, you know, hoping to bridge this gap for the sky between the current state of knowledge and what clinical practice and everyday behaviors might be. And then I'll just close off sharing with you a couple of other additional resources that might be helpful for you as well. So on the Stroke Engine website, if you go into the e-learning section, there's actually the AEROBICS online modules that are available, and they have also been updated to reflect the new 2019 guidelines. So some of you or many of you may have done the original AEROBICS, just to highlight that they have now been updated to reflect the most recent guidelines. And Marilyn McKay-Lyons and Marianne Thornton were kind enough to share just some data on how the AEROBICS has been accessed across the world. So there have been, you know, over 700 logins from 41 nations globally, which has been really exciting, and I think a really cool thing that we have as a resource here in Canada and developed by Canadian researchers and clinicians here. Marilyn also published, again, just a highlights of the updated guidelines in the Physical Therapy Journal that was just published last month. So I provided the link here for anyone who would like to see that. And then I had also just seen, for those who are on the call who are physiotherapists and may be attending the Canadian Physiotherapy Association Congress in May, there's a pre-Congress course that Marilyn is also running that might be of interest to you, and that's specifically around implementing the aerobics guidelines into practice. So I just wanted to highlight that. For the original set of guidelines, I was lucky enough to work with the Canadian Partnership for Stroke Recovery and one of our McMaster physiotherapy students to develop a set of patient-friendly resources that were based on the guidelines. And so those are still available online. They do reflect the original guidelines, the older guidelines, but in terms of kind of what does this mean for your patient, those the overall message is still the same. So I think it's still certainly relevant for anyone who might find this helpful for their patients. So just in closing, hopefully this has helped to just provide a bit of an overview of the new guidelines. As the new evidence continues to emerge about the benefits of exercise, you know, clinical practice guidelines like the aerobics guidelines should continue to be updated to reflect what's currently known, and the new aerobics guidelines are currently available. So that's it for me. I certainly welcome questions and discussion from anyone who's online.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tang, for your presentation today. We certainly would welcome questions. So just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, please enter them either into the question or chat box, and we'd be happy to entertain them. Just while we're doing that, I will let you know that the webinar today has been recorded, and the link is going to be on the Central East Stroke Network website, which is www.cesnstroke.ca, and it will be under the professional resources side, under the professional side, under the resources tab. So if you do have colleagues who are interested in viewing this webinar, or if you're wanting to go back and check some of the resource links, that will be an opportunity.
And my email contact is here on this final slide. So if anybody has any questions that come up after the fact, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to hear from you.
We have a very quiet audience today in terms of questions. I do see someone saying thank you, so we certainly do appreciate you taking the time to present today.
Not at all. I think some of the discussions that I've had with different clinician groups and community groups is, the guidelines are certainly helpful. It's more, how do we implement this into practice? And I don't have, kind of the magic answers, but I do always welcome dialogue because I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other. Some sites that may have had some success in implementing these guidelines are usually, really happy to share what are some of the lessons learned. And I think that's also a great opportunity. I think that's one of the great things about our networks, the stroke networks, is the opportunity to dialogue with each other. So again, if anyone has any, it doesn't even have to be questions for me, it could be just comments on how you may have implemented this or used the guidelines or tried to use the guidelines in your practice.
So again, I will thank you again very much for taking the time to present. We certainly have comments in the chat box acknowledging the resources that are available online and the appreciation of that. Just to reiterate, the webinar will be located on the CESN website. I know you asked for the address again, so it's www.cesnstroke.ca on the professional side under the resources tab, and we will send that information out. So if there aren't any other questions, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you again, Dr. Tang, for presenting today, and also to thank all of you as attendees for participating in today's webinar. I would ask you to take a few minutes of your time to answer the survey that will appear on completion of the webinar, and wish you a good day, and thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.